So today we're going to be taking a look at a scenario where NATO and the SCO go to war. Now NATO is of course the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization, but the SCO is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a political and economic alliance between all of the nations in red you see over here in Asia, whereas NATO is of course a military alliance based around the Northern Atlantic. Now realistically, a war like this is impossible because the SCO is not a military alliance. What if it happened anyway? That's the scenario we're going to be taking a look at today. So if you guys do enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. All the support is greatly appreciated as we're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers relatively soon. As you'll notice, the dresser in the background has now vanished, which is a sign of me moving very soon. And on the topic of that, I will say that there are only 3 videos left, including this one, that will be recorded in this room. I pretty much recorded every single video on my YouTube channel within the past 9 years in this room, so it's gonna be weird getting a new environment, but we'll see how that goes. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump straight into this video. So somehow, some way, the SCO has turned into a military organization, and they are now at war with NATO. And the political and economical effect that this would have on the world would be absolutely horrible. First of all, having the 2 largest economies in the world, being both China and the United States, having a war against each other is not a good thing, ever. But throwing in other countries like India, as well as very many EU countries, will just make the matter even worse. Additionally, both sides have an extreme amount of nuclear weapons, meaning that if this war were to happen in real life, it would honestly end in nuclear annihilation and probably wipe out the human race. So we're not going to really factor in nuclear bombs in this scenario because otherwise this video would already be over. But as you can see, NATO is making the first move here. They are invading into parts of Russia, and if NATO wants to have any chance of winning this war, they need to get Russia out of the way as soon as possible. Luckily for NATO, India and China are all the way over here in Eastern and Southern Asia, meaning that they can mostly operate in Russia without these two getting too involved. Now we also have to remember that there are countries like Iran and Pakistan who are both heavily populated and heavily capable of carrying out military offenses. When you compare NATO and the SCO side by side, you get some interesting results. For example, the SCO has by far the manpower advantage, and that is mostly thanks to both China and India, who are extremely populated, the 2 most populated countries in the world. But as far as military capability, that actually goes to NATO. And that is due to the fact that NATO's military is very modern and very technologically advanced compared to the militaries of the world. NATO has the technology advantage, but they also have air superiority advantage, and that is in large part thanks to the United States, but also thanks to countries like the UK and France, as well as Turkey. Comparing it to the SCO countries, the only 2 countries that can even rival NATO's air superiority is Russia and China, with all the other countries having much smaller and a lot less capable air forces. Now, as you can see, NATO's invasion into Russia is going extremely well. They have now cut Russia into 2 parts, separating the Kola Peninsula from the rest of mainland Russia. Additionally, attempts have been made to invade into Kaliningrad, but as I've been told many times before, this thing is like a fortress, good luck invading it. But in all reality, Kaliningrad is completely surrounded by NATO members and has no connection to Russia at all, as NATO would most likely secure the Baltic Sea and kick out any Russian ships in the area, pretty much starving Kaliningrad. So yeah, we're just gonna go ahead and color them in all the way blue, as there is no way for Russia to reach their exclave. Now, I do not really want to add other countries to this war. I kind of purely just want it to be NATO versus the SCO, but it is almost impossible for this war to work out without there being a few more countries involved. Now, for every country I add to one side of the war, I'll add a country to the opposing team, so it's all balanced out and fairly even. Now, the main country I'm talking about here that I believe should be added to this war is Ukraine. And I think the reasoning for that is fairly simple. And without a doubt, if this scenario were to break out, Ukraine would automatically be added to NATO's side. Now, like I just said, I do want to make sure that these 2 sides are pretty balanced, so in exchange for adding Ukraine, we are going to be adding Belarus to the red team. Anyway, with the front line in Europe being brought in, we now have more military activity, and this time it's taking place in Belarus. NATO was kind of expecting Belarus's entrance into the war after they agreed to allow Ukraine to join, letting for the jumping of this country to take place. Now, of course, Russian forces were already probably here, meaning that this large of an advance would be unlikely, but you also have to account for Russia's troops in Ukraine. So while NATO gains a lot of ground here, Russia is now sending even more forces to the Ukrainian front line, more than they have in real life, making it more possible for Russia to start an advance into this country and actually show off their number 2 ranking, which I know that I always critique Russia's ranking as number 2 in the world because I do fully believe that China is stronger than Russia at this point, but Russia is still a top 10 military power compared to Ukraine, who really isn't. Now, of course, Ukraine here is being supplied by all of NATO in full as they have all joined the war, meaning that this much of an advance actually may not even happen. But anyway, up north, a key strategic city of Russia's is being threatened with encirclement, and that of course is the city of St. Petersburg, a very historic city, the former capital capital of the Russian Empire, and of course it was also previously known as Leningrad. NATO will fully encircle the city, cutting off all Russian supplies to the area and once again starving the city, which will slowly but surely lead to its defeat. So far so good for NATO. Now there is really only one front line in this war, and that does make things a little bit easier for NATO at least. And yes, there technically is a front line down here between Turkey and Iran, but more likely than not we wouldn't see any fighting take place here because of the geography of the region. Very mountainous. So instead we're seeing all the bloodshed in Europe, which is what we usually see in history. Anyway, the capital of Belarus will be captured by NATO forces. Minsk is fallen over to NATO, and with this Belarus starts to slowly capitulate as defensive forces from Russia retreat back to their own border, and the Belarusian military is left on its own until eventually NATO occupies a majority of the country. In response to this, Russia will speed up their advance into Ukraine, now pushing up against the Dnieper River and threatening the capital of Ukraine, which is of course Kyiv. NATO forces at this point are mostly focusing on the Ukrainian front. There were very little gains that happened near the Baltics, but NATO does want to ensure that these three countries do not fall, which is what we always see happen in AdizzPro scenarios, just not in this one. That's right, we're spicing it up a little bit. Now, what is the United States and China doing in this scenario? They are both the leaders of their respective alliances. Of course, the United States is the leader of NATO. I mean, there technically isn't a direct leader of NATO, but the United States does all the heavy lifting in NATO, so they're technically the leader. And as for China, you know, it's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so I would assume that they're the leader because it's called the Shanghai Cooperation, which Shanghai is in China, if you didn't know that, if you somehow didn't know that. So these two masterminds are, of course, sending their troops to the respective front lines and fighting up against each other, but they're also probably carrying out massive cyber attacks against each other, maybe even playing naval games, especially over here in East Asia, where the United States has very many military bases surrounding China, and of course, they are more than likely using these military bases. So the ball is technically in NATO's court here. They have the advantage with the US having a very dominant and long-range navy, whereas China's navy is more focused on regional affairs, especially down here in the South China Sea, but of course we have seen them in other places before. Anyway, back to the front line, NATO's success is continuing to be, well, success. And now the alliance is emphasizing the Ukrainian front line and sending a majority of their troops here to push back against Russia. They will liberate all of the bank west of the Dnieper River and also have major counteroffensives up north near Kyiv, protecting the city and restoring Ukrainian morale. It's at this point that we see NATO finally fully annex all of Belarus as they start a key offensive in the south of Ukraine, aiming to capture the key city of Kherson, in which they are successful in doing, but not without heavy losses. With this, Russia has been separated from their occupied area in southern Crimea. Of course, there is a Crimean bridge that connects Russia to this area of Ukraine, but without a doubt that has been blown up by NATO operatives, meaning that the Russian Navy will be responsible for evacuating this area if so needed, which actually might be needed pretty soon because NATO is focusing in on Crimea, kicking all of Russia's occupation out of southern Ukraine, and now attempting to enter into the peninsula, in which Russia would most likely respond by blowing up this Crimean bridge, making the invasion of Crimea have to be an amphibious one. So in comes the naval war games between NATO and Russia, and without a doubt NATO would absolutely curb stomp Russia in the naval war game. So Russia's navy at this point has been completely destroyed. We can thank you for that, but we can also thank you for that. Two of the strongest navies in the world, Russia's navy is well, it's kind of mid, to be honest. And I do think that a lot of people miss the point that like Russia is not super technologically advanced, especially compared to NATO. Like their equipment is very old, their navy is, you know, it's outdated. They have a lot of outdated stuff in their active personnel, and comparing that to modern equipment from NATO and, you know, modern vessels and stuff, Russia's navy is at an extreme disadvantage. So when you see Russia get curb stomped by NATO often, that's not because I'm like biased or anything. It's because NATO's navy is actually better than Russia's navy. And yes, they would get hurt this bad. A realistic war between NATO and Russia would not go well for Russia at all. A lot of people miss that, but I mean, that's just kind of how it would go down. That is always assuming, of course, that Russia doesn't unleash its nuclear arsenal on everybody, which would result in MAD and also result in the end of the world. But like I said earlier, we're not focusing on that in this scenario. We're only focusing in on conventional warfare between NATO and the SCO. But now you can see that Russia is being fully invaded by NATO. It's not going so great for the Russians, who are struggling to hold off NATO forces, even with help from other countries like India and China. Now, like I said earlier, China and the USA are likely having their own war games right now, not too focused on the European front line. Of course, they are still sending their military there, but they're also having these naval skirmishes over here in the east of China, especially around where the US has a ton of military bases in South Korea, Japan, and even the Philippines. A NATO invasion of both China and India is downright unrealistic, dare I say impossible, but at the same time, a Chinese invasion of America is also downright impossible and extremely unrealistic. So in all reality, if this war scenario were to actually play out in real life, and also assume that no nuclear bombs are used, it would end in either destruction, both sides wearing each other down to their absolute breaking point, or it would end in stalemate and subsequent peace, which would just benefit neither side. Anyway, as you can see, NATO's front line has finally reached the key city of Moscow in Russia, which of course is also their capital city. It is here that we see Vladimir Putin flee the city and take refuge over here in Beijing, where he will most likely be safe, as NATO forces fight extremely hard to capture this city, losing tens of thousands of soldiers, but nonetheless taking the government of Russia away from it, and sending ripples throughout the entire country that this war is not like any other war that Russia has fought thus far. This is a very powerful opponent, and of course it's being backed by the most strong country in the world, the United States. I'm not glazing. I mean, that's just all factual stuff that I just said. A lot of people think that I'm biased to the West, which, you know, is not true, because I have a lot of grievances against the West and what they do and their whole political structure and just how the West carries itself. So no, I'm not biased to the West. I'm just realistic. I like to use factual information like what I looked up before this video. Yes, the SCO has an extreme number advantage against NATO in terms of, you know, pure manpower, but NATO, like I said, has that technological advantage. They have extreme air superiority against the SCO, and air superiority is kind of important in modern warfare. In fact, it's very important. That determines whether you can bomb a Russian base 100 miles off the border of Ukraine or not. And yes, that is exactly what NATO is doing. In fact, NATO probably has air superiority over the entirety of Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, as well as Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Iran, maybe. I don't know if NATO has the numbers to do all of these countries at once, all 6 of them, which kind of plays back into the fact that the SCO has the pure number advantage, more than likely having more aircraft than NATO, but once again not having the technology of NATO. Anyway, the former city of Stalingrad has been captured, or as it's called modernly, Volgograd, and this is yet another huge loss for Russia, as they are now been split into 2 pieces, with southern Russia not having any connection to northern Russia, although of course Russia can use Kazakhstan to get down here for now, or not, because NATO has just reached the Caspian Sea and officially cut southern Russia off from the rest of Russia. So with this happening, NATO would likely focus in on the Caucasus region, as Russian oil supplies in this area are very tasty. And we do also know that the United States is in this war, meaning that the United States wants that oil. The United States probably also wants this oil. Maybe we'll see a naval invasion here. But with southern Russia completely falling, Russia is in full-on collapse. Now, they do have a few key major cities over here, which they are still holding on to, but if those were to fall, Russia would be in big trouble. For now though, NATO will secure all of the Kola Peninsula and broaden their front line in northern Russia, which for the most part is undefended. Now at this point, the red team probably isn't too panicked. They knew that NATO would have an advantage early on in this war, especially considering that Russia is right on their border and NATO is stronger than Russia straight up. The real fighting begins when NATO starts to get near China and India, which are unlikely to be invaded, but we'll have to see if any new front lines open up, which is entirely possible, especially with the United States Navy having a very fun time over here in the East Asian area. Almost said East Asian Sea, but I don't think that exists. Back in Kazakhstan though, the red team will finally decide that it is time to try a counteroffensive, and this is the area they choose to do it in, focusing in on capturing Volgograd back from NATO forces. As you can see, the counteroffensive does go fairly well for the red team, but they do fall short in taking the key major city, but they do make unexpected strides toward the Ukrainian border, eventually meeting up with it. Now, does this mean that they're going to invade Ukraine? Obviously not. There are far bigger issues to worry about, such as Moscow, which they will attempt a counteroffensive into. Spoiler alert, that doesn't go too well, and they get kicked back even further than they were previously. They chase them all the way back to this major city here, which I don't think has, oh yeah, it does have a name. All right, this one is called Nizhny Novgorod, but it will soon be renamed to NATO military base. Additionally, up north, NATO is sweeping through northern Russia. Once again, this area is probably undefended, not much happening here, so NATO forces could just, you know, walk through here and technically claim it as their own, even if they wouldn't do that because there isn't much happening here. Like, same thing with these islands here, NATO would not invade them, but we're just going to color them in blue anyway. At this point, the red team is starting to push back in more areas, and now the Moscow counteroffensive is becoming more and more apparent. Now, NATO is going to do their best to hold back this counteroffensive, but they're also going to start a new offensive from Ukraine in the south, which will kind of impede on this bulge here that the red team is presenting. Pause. And they slowly start to close in on the corridor that the red team has here, but the red team is not stupid. They will realize that NATO is doing this. They will remove some of their troops from the offensive, and in exchange for that, they will be pushing back these two offensives, stopping the possible encirclement, and reinforcing the red team's counteroffensive. Now, while that is all happening, NATO forces in the south here have re-entered into Kazakhstan, further securing Volgograd from red team forces, and invading into new land that they had not previously occupied. NATO finds that Kazakhstan, for the most part, is undefended. A lot of the forces of the red team are fighting up north near the Moscow counteroffensive, meaning that these forces kind of just spill in until they eventually don't, as Iran and Pakistan, as well as the Stan countries, will send their forces to deal with this, which absolutely decimates NATO's invading army and pushes them back to this point. Back up north, the Moscow counteroffensive is continuing to show promise as they are now reaching the gates of the city. Additionally, another army group has recaptured this city here, which is a huge morale boost for the Russian fighters that are in blue team occupied territory, along for a very large pocket up here to break away and eventually meet up with the army group and encircle a ton of NATO troops. NATO will make an emphasis in trying to save these troops as there are very many in the encirclement, but the red team will do a ton of damage before NATO can get there. They do save some troops, but not enough. The result of this is a huge sweeping event in the south of Moscow, which pushes past the city and also expands the red team's front line in the south. The red team will push closer and closer to the city of Moscow until eventually they are right there and super close. Before red team troops can enter into the capital city, though, a very unexpected event happens. The sound of an eagle screeching can be heard in the eastern points of Russia as the United States Navy makes a naval landing in this peninsula, which I think recently got hit by a tsunami, if I'm not mistaken. That's completely irrelevant to the scenario, though. But Russia wasn't expecting a naval invasion of this force in this region, especially considering that this region isn't too valuable to Russia. Now, of course, they weren't like completely surprised by this. That's not how war works. Of course, the Russian Navy and the American Navy would have been battling each other in this region, and Russia would know if their entire navy was defeated, which is exactly what happened here, allowing them to send a little bit of forces over here to deal with it or contact China to do exactly that, and that's what we have happening. So China comes to the aid of Russia in this region, but unfortunately for China, they aren't exactly in position to stop this exact naval landing. They're more so focused on protecting this area of Russia. But with the Americans having a landing over here in Russia, it does certainly bring up the question of, does the red team have the capabilities to hold off this kind of thing? And the answer to that is probably no. China and friends are more likely focused on saving Russia in the west than they are in saving Russia in the east. So when this happens, they probably don't care too much. And also, there's nothing here. So like, go ahead and take it, I guess. Now, would the US actually invade into Siberia? No, absolutely not. Siberia is a frozen tundra of nothingness, but there is also a little bit of oil there, so that might explain the US's ambitions here. But basically, they're just kind of pushing around and setting up a foothold over here in East Asia, one that China probably isn't too happy about, and one that China will probably send forces up to deal with if it ever starts to impede near their territory. For now, though, they're not worried. They're more worried about fighting off the US Navy over here, which they are still doing. Now, if this war were to actually happen in real life with these exact sides, it would escalate into a very, very serious conflict with very many countries across the world joining in. But more specifically, I want to refer to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, who would more than likely come to the aid of the United States in the face of defeating China. And like I said earlier, I don't want to add these countries into the war because I kind of want to keep it to just NATO versus the SCO, but this war would be a lot different if there wasn't that restriction, as the whole island chain over here in the Pacific would join the war on the west side, definitely changing this theater. This would be a lot more interesting over here, but like I said, I just don't want to add these countries in. But with all that being said, let's go back over to the city of Moscow. Now, NATO does not want the red team to recapture this. This would be a huge moral defeat for them, so they will do their absolute best to push back the red team's forces in the area, but what they fail to do is push back the invading forces as they walk into Moscow and retake the city. NATO's worst nightmare has just come into reality, but there is still hope for their victory. They want to start a new offensive going north of this front line and heading towards these major cities out here. Russia is connected by like a few networks that kind of bounce from city to city, especially in this region. And then I believe the network goes something like this all the way to these cities. Basically, Russia is just connected by these major networks between these cities all the way over here to its east. But as you can see, getting after this area would be very detrimental to Russia's connection. It's unlikely that NATO would be able to reach over to this area because it's so far in and over here near Kazakhstan. They could focus on this area, but there are a lot of red team troops here. So NATO believes that their best luck is pushing towards these major cities, which is exactly what they will do, sending a lot of their forces towards this one, which is named Samara? They capture Samara, and their forces begin to move north at a very quick pace, a pace that the red team is failing to respond to with appropriate measures. And in addition to a northern advance, there's also a southern advance that is being made from Northern Territory, but this one is a lot weaker and a lot less focused on capturing major cities. Back over here where Moscow is, the red team's forces will go ahead and secure the city, pushing blue team forces way out of the area. Additionally, they will make pushes towards the Ukrainian front line, which they hope will demoralize the nation and subsequently also demoralize NATO. Back over here though, NATO's front is going as good as it could, as they now capture another major city, and at this point the red team needs to act before these troops all get encircled. Have no fear though, the red team always has a plan, as they plan to make an encirclement of their own. Having two spearheads pop out from these two territories, they will quickly move to encircle these NATO troops, which causes panic in the Western nations, forcing them to exhilarate their spearhead, losing them a lot of resources in troops, but they do complete it, encircling a bunch of red team troops here. But then the red team also breaks through, taking back this major city and reconnecting with their front line. Basically, the SCO and NATO just swapped annexed lands. And now we're back to even, except NATO still has this major city. So it's very apparent at this point that neither side can make too much of a major advance against the other. While Russia at this stage is extremely weak and probably just depressed, they're still the largest country in the world, and there's still a very vast amount of land between this NATO front and this NATO front, making a complete occupation of Russia extremely unlikely. There's also the fact that NATO is no longer wanting to push into Kazakhstan, as they have to focus on the amount of troops that are just protecting this area. A huge stick in the mud for NATO, halting their offensive plans into the Central Asian region. If NATO were to want to make a move on a country like Iran, they would find it extremely difficult to do so, as that would be a very long-range operation. It's probably safe to assume that Egypt would not allow the Suez Canal to be used for military use by NATO, meaning that they would have to go all the way around Africa just to invade Iran. While the US might be able to do that, these other NATO countries would have a very hard time in doing so, as their navies aren't too doctrined at long-scale naval conflict, other than maybe the UK. Alternatively, what they could do is base in Australia and then move across the Indian Ocean to invade Iran, which might make for a shorter distance. But then you also have to remember that India and Pakistan's navies would be guarding the waters around this area, and also probably guarding this strait here. So yeah, an invasion of Iran isn't too likely at this point. And like I said earlier, this little border right here wouldn't seem very much fighting, if any at all, due to the geographic challenges of the area. So what is NATO and the CSO going to do? Their two objectives are pretty clear. NATO wants to get the CSO out of this area, and the CSO wants to get NATO out of this area. One is easier to do than the other, but SCO forces will slowly push back NATO forces here. This is where a lot of NATO's army still is, or not, because as it turns out, NATO has reorganized their entire front line to focus on recapturing Moscow. So when the SCO rapidly invades this area, they are kind of confused. They continue to push in and face very little resistance, but then NATO tanks start to roll across the front line once again and recapture the city of Moscow in a stunning defeat of SCO forces. Additionally, we also see the SCO's whole offensive towards Ukraine fail. NATO's logistical advantage is very, very apparent in this specific operation, and so is the technology, as even though NATO is very outnumbered on this front line, they still push back SCO forces. They even take back these two major cities, which is a huge defeat for the SCO, as they are slowly starting to get pushed out of this area of Russia. Now in other areas, they're able to push back NATO, and more specifically in Kazakhstan, they do a very good job at eliminating almost all NATO forces from this country, but the more valuable land over here is what's being lost, and a specific country in East Asia isn't too happy about it. China knows that their alliance is slowly losing the front in Russia, which makes them not so happy. China knows that them and India, as well as Pakistan and Iran, aren't too involved in the fighting because it's so far away from their borders, and they know that if they were more involved, that this front line would look a lot more different. So China's going to take out some of their anger on the US. Remember this cute little foothold that the US had over here? Yeah, China's not too happy about it. They're sending a lot of troops to deal with it, a lot more troops than the US would have ever imagined them using, which granted does cause them a lot of casualties, as China is basically just throwing soldiers at the United States' guns. Never really a good strategy in warfare, but for the most part, China will kick the US out of this area, limiting them just to this peninsula. Additionally, the Chinese and American navies in this region have likely worn each other down to a point to where the naval fighting is very, very scarce. And it is here that we are reaching the end stages of this war. To be honest with you guys, neither side can realistically win this war. You know, I don't always strive to be realistic and stuff, but even in an unrealistic way, it's almost impossible to declare a specific winner in this video, because the two sides not only are they pretty even, but these front lines are huge. These are the strongest countries in the world fighting against each other. You know, you have the US, Russia, China, and India. Those are 1, 2, 3, 4 in power rankings. Then you also have countries like the UK, France, Germany, and Turkey on the blue team. And then you also have to look over here. The red team has Iran and Pakistan, 2 very strong countries. Now, if this scenario were to drag on for a little bit longer, we're kind of extending past the realm of realism at this point. We would likely see that NATO would have a very easy time invading into Central Asia with these very weak countries. Now, of course, they would be supported by their allies, but trust me, NATO would have a much easier time invading Kazakhstan than they would invading Russia. Speaking of Russia, if this war were to drag on even further, the SCO would eventually start to liberate very vast portions of Russia, more than likely reaching the city of Moscow and also liberating some of, if not all of, northern Russia. But that is just the hypothetical. We're going to go back to the front line that I just had, and we're going to be ending the video here. So let me know in the comments what you thought about this scenario. If this was a total war and both sides exhausted all of their resources and manpower, who do you think would win? Let me know in the comments. Do you think NATO would win with their superior technology and superior equipment, or do you think the SCO would win with their raw number advantage? Me personally, I do believe that the SCO would slowly but surely win this war, and really the only way that you can win this war is if you take out all of Europe for the SCO. I do think they could do that just simply because China and India both have 1.4 billion people within them each respectively. Sorry, my voice cut out there, but that would be the goal, to take out Europe. And then, you know, invading the US would be extremely hard, especially in the end stages of this war, where the SCO would be extinguishing all of their resources invading Europe. Now, on the other side of things, NATO would probably have an easier time winning this war than the SCO would. And that's because the United States has a very strong foothold in Europe. This would be, you know, very hard to lose. And even if the United States did lose this, they themselves would not see any war on their own soil, because at that point they would likely just surrender. So yeah, even though that NATO has the geographical advantage, do you still think the SCO would win? Also, let me know that in the comments. But as for this video, it is over. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you're new, because all the support is super greatly appreciated as we're trying to get to 200K very soon. Once again, I am moving out this weekend. I will be moving on Saturday, August the 9th, which is a day that a video is posted, but it's also a day that I usually record on, meaning that Monday's video this week or next week will be a pre-recorded video. Not that that means anything. It's only going to be pre-recorded by a few days, and it's only being pre-recorded because I probably won't have the time to record on Saturday. Just maybe. Just a theory. I don't know. I might be moving. Man, I've said that so many times. But anyway, once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. And of course, thank you to all our super fans. This includes Serminator, Static FN, Jazzy Jerboa, Chill Turn Mapping, CTG on YT, Omega the YouTuber, Vista Napper, Garbage Trucks, Pro Wixo, 7353, Gamer, RS, Australian Geoball Mapping, Augusto, Norwegian, Gail Martinez, Freezioid, Laser Tase, Pablo Sigma Cat, Toad 45, Death Strider X, and DW Cool Dude. Once again, thank you guys.